Hello and welcome to Mindscapes, our series of conversations with men and women whose ideas, vision and philosophy define our contemporary world. My guest today started his career as an officer in the Indian Railways, but he grew and has emerged to be one of India's leading contemporary historians. He's been the biographer of Gokhale, the Nehrus, and above all perhaps of Mahatma Gandhi. He's written extensively on India's struggles for freedom. He was the first director of the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library. I'm delighted to welcome Mr. B R Nanda. Welcome.
Thank you.
You've had this sort of incredible ringside to history. You have been a student of this process of history. And it's been now 50 years down the line from that cataclysmic moment, that cataclysmic striving, shall I say. Do you despair? Do you feel optimistic? Do you feel good about the 50 years? What's the sort of first emotion that comes to your mind?
Well, I would say that I haven't thought about that. After all, for a historian, the main thing is to recapture the past. What it was, what happened, how it happened, and then to share what he finds with his contemporaries.
You know, it's frequently sort of held, assumed that one of the purposes of history is that, you know, what is it that we can learn from history for the future? What are the lessons of history for contemporary India? What are the lessons of history for its future?
Well, there are some general lessons, for example, violence, war, hatred, vendetta doesn't bring you any real rewards. I mean, you are self-destructive. But there are no conclusions as to how you are going to deal with the economic or social problems of today, because the situations have changed. But you may learn about the values, about the methods, which might carry you through your own times.
Have you felt that your response and interpretation of history has perhaps in some ways changed over time, because you know, you have been recording history of what you have witnessed, even if not sort of immediately and intimately, and there is the perspective of 50 years in a sense. It's a dynamic process.
All the books which I have written are based on what we call primary material. They are not written on the versions of people who have written other books, so to say. When I wrote on Gandhiji, started writing on Gandhiji in 1948, his correspondence was being collected, which was published in 100 volumes later on. And I was able to see it in the manuscripts or photostats long before it was printed. I was able to get access to the government records in the National Archives and so on. So I was on safer ground than people who depended on newspapers, who depended on recollections of people and so on. For example, Louis Fisher, he depended on his personal contact with Gandhiji in the 1940s, in 1940. And Tendulkar, who depended mostly on newspapers and other material which is easily accessible. He was too early for the documentary material and didn't try to, because he wasn't a historian. So both of them produced very popular books.
Right.
But because they were not based on primary material, I'm sure if they were alive today, they would have to find they need revision.
Yeah, I meant sort of more than revisioning history, was also the aspect of interpreting history. You know, 50 years down the line, we do see Nehru perhaps in different ways. We see him sort of less passionately than perhaps the passion he himself experienced for India.
No, there I think you are right. Judgment varies with passage of time. Each generation judges the past in view of its own opinions. For example, now, in the age of liberalization and globalization, the socialist concept seems completely out of date, and people say that Nehru did not know his job because he believed in public sector and so on. But if you were in Nehru's place in 1947 and had to run this country without any infrastructure, industrial structure, and where the private capital did not have the resources to build anything big, any steel plant or something, you did not want foreign capital because you had experience with the East India Company, and you, in history, and you felt that once they get foothold, toehold, they can repeat the the colonial performance. So, considering everything, that vision is there. But in my case, I would say that I did not have any ideological blinkers. I was not in a group of historians, schools of thought. I did not belong to any party, so I was free to judge.
How have you, over the years, viewed the essential Nehru the man?
You see, I have studied Nehru over the years, and I studied not only on the basis of what he had said or what he had written, and to which I had access. I also studied what his opponents were saying, what his critics were saying. I tried to analyze the situation and see whether his assessments were right or wrong. So I was not a partisan of Nehru. I was a director of the Nehru library, but I wasn't a partisan of Nehru. I wasn't even a partisan of Gandhi. Well, I recollect now, the London Times wrote, reviewing my biography of Gandhi, that I rescued him from the sentimentalists and the debunkers. And Attlee, who was the man who bound up the British Empire in India, as you know, in 47, he wrote an article in Spectator, and he said that the one of the characteristics of my book was it was impartial. So I tried, what I'm saying is that I tried to get all points of view. I tried to place myself in Gandhi's position, Nehru's position, in the position of their opponents. That's the job of the historian, nothing new. All the historians do that.
From the point of view of this impartiality.
You see, the point is, how do I understand a situation unless I place myself in the social milieu, in the economic, political milieu of those days? It is not only by studying Gandhi and Nehru, but studying the whole period, as you say. I didn't study one or two characters. I studied the entire period, the pre-Gandhian period, the post-Gandhian period. I was trying to educate myself. I was trying to educate myself to get the background. Then when I was studying these individuals, I tried to get everything what they had done, written, so on.
What was the essence of Nehru's personality that
you see,
struck you, shall I say?
His great passion was for the freedom and unity of India. That was, even as a boy in Harrow in Cambridge, and that was his last concern when he died.
And yet, sort of, each of us are flawed in some way. We're human, essentially.
No, but I should imagine that he did make misjudgments of situations and men, but there are very few. There has been no great political leader who has not made misjudgments.
What do you think his greatest misjudgment was?
Well, I think his greatest misjudgment was judgment of China. He was an amateur historian, as you know. He wrote the Discovery of India and the world history, glimpses of world history. And he had a very, should I say, idealistic view of Asian history, of Indian history and the Chinese history having some parallels, and of they having great cultures and the great harmony between them and so on. But he forgot that the communist China was not representing that culture. And he accepted their, should I say, professions at face value. And that was a great misjudgment. But maybe, come back to it, it was partly misjudgment, but partly his predicament. He had decided not to align himself with either of the superpowers. He felt, and he said so, that independent India would frame its own foreign policy. It would not be tied to the apron strings of any great power. And he felt that if he wanted to be even slightly hostile to China, which seemed to be at that time allied to Russia, it would be a difficult position for him, because he didn't want to join the American bloc, he didn't want to join the Russian bloc. So, even though I think there was a fear in his mind that the Chinese might behave and may become his hostile to India in the future, he felt that, like Russia, over the years they were mellow. Chinese revolution, like Russian revolution, will become less and less aggressive. There is an interview which he gave, a series he gave to Chester Bowles, who was America's ambassador in India, and Chester Bowles wrote his book. And I think the book was in early 50s. And you'll find that he has foreseen possibilities. But at this, of Chinese, of threat from China. But he said that the answer to that threat is not to militarily prepare to fight China, but to expose China to world opinion by admitting China in the United Nations, by trying to be friendly to China, because China is also suffering from fear psychosis and kind of thing, that the world is against it and so on and so forth. So you see, it is a combination of various things. It was partly misjudgment, part deliberate calculation that if he tries to be friendly to China, the estrangement and hostility may be avoided.
What about the revisioning, in a sense, of Gandhiji?
I have written a couple of long essays on Gandhi and Nehru. And I think it's a very complex relationship and a very fascinating relationship. He differed with Gandhiji in the national movement. I did not go into details. But it was not a one-way traffic. Gandhiji changed some of his policies in deference to Nehru and the younger people. And Nehru also bowed to Gandhiji several times to avoid a split. The fact that in 25 years there was no split in the Indian National Congress, and the younger generation was carried along by Gandhiji, was due to the fact that Gandhiji was very open and very generous. Many of these people, Jayaprakash Narayan, for example, he started as a critic of Gandhi and then ended up as a devotee. But this was, in Nehru's case, a two-way traffic. They were both, should I say, interacting with each other. Now, the idea that Nehru upset everything, changed everything which Gandhiji wanted to do is not quite correct. You can see certain areas, say in civil liberties, a federal structure, freedom of the press, freedom of worship, secularism, all these are Gandhi's ideas, which Nehru has, there was no difference between them. And foreign policy, in the orientation towards peace and opposition to use of atoms, for example, for atomic warfare and so on. Influences there. The difference really was in the economic field, where Nehru put all his bets on industrialism. And though it gave India infrastructure, industrial as well as, I would say, for the nation state, you required security and so on and so forth. But it did not solve certain problems of basic education, health, poverty and so on. And now there's an increasing realization that Gandhiji's ideas in these matters were very, very modern, and they should have received more attention.
Do you think it's ironical that a section of the right wing, as it were, is using the idea, raising the flag of Swadeshi?
Yes, it is. I would say that it was unexpected. But then look at it differently. Gandhiji's ideas were not understood in his time, even by people who claimed to be his close followers. I have seen a letter by Rafi Ahmed Kadwai, one of the staunchest Indian nationalists, writing to Nehru that we have to give up these Gandhian ideas of scrupulousness and non-violence and integrity and all that, because, you know, this movement becomes pious futility if we do this. And many people at that time felt that non-violence was only a kind of tactic against the foreign rule to get rid of it. But Gandhi said, no, non-violence is a way of life. Non-violence is a creed in politics which is applicable among our own relationship, among relationship with the British, and with the relationship with the world. We did not understand this. See how much violence there is in the country today.
What about this aspect of rewriting history? That has been a recent concern, some debate that an ideology or the dominant ideology of the time feels tempted to influence how we read and interpret our past.
Frankly, historian doesn't have an ideology to write history. I would put it this way. He has to understand what happened. He has to try to recapture the past, then interpret it in a language and with basic evidence which carries conviction to other people. That's all. That's his job. It is not, I do not think there should be any dominant ideology at any time. I mean, and then if there is a dominant ideology, other people are free to write, to controvert it. So what historians need is integrity in their own writing. It makes no difference to me that people who have written books against Gandhi or against Nehru or for Nehru. I must write what I think is warranted by the evidence to which I have access.
That is a function, I suppose, of the historian's integrity, but historians work within institutions. Historians need to be published. Historians are gratified when their writings and works are used as textbooks, are made widely available. So historians are subject, shall we say, to influences.
I agree. There are temptations, or there are distractions. If you want to tell the truth, and if you want to tell exactly what you feel, and you are not playing to the gallery, well, you may not sell like hotcakes. That's different. But somebody said that a classic is a book in which 1,000 copies sell for 100 years, and a bestseller is a book in which 100,000 copies sell in 1 year, and that's the end of it. So I suppose this ideological history, this biased history, will die its own death. This is what happens in this kind of writing. It is in vogue for 10 years. Then next 10 years they find no, it is subject to revision. Next 10 years probably they find that it doesn't carry conviction. I mean, you run a risk either way.
In general, do you feel that India of the 21st century is being generous, is being acknowledging of the achievements and the triumphs of some of the people that you have written about, of the towering figures that you have felt that Indian nationalism at that time produced?
I am dismayed by the indifference of the present generation to the story of Indian independence. It's no longer a subject which seems to excite people. But I remember in the first 2 decades, it was different. A book on the freedom movement was an event. You could not meet a person who had not seen it or read it. But now it's different. I suppose, number one, books are not so popular as magazines and I mean any sensational event or any scam or something will probably bring you a bestseller. But I wish there was more interest in.
So what is your sort of continuing role that you see for yourself as a historian?
Well, I do not know whether I have any other role but to continue the work I am doing, whatever little more I can do. I find this period still very fascinating. I think this country was remarkably fortunate that between 1880 and 1930 or so, 30, it produced such a remarkable number of great men and women.
Why do you think we have failed to do so in contemporary India?
Because the challenges were great there.
Is the challenge of nationalism somehow
You see the challenge,
more engaging?
The challenge of subjection, foreign rule was there. And you find in the letters Jawaharlal Nehru writes to his father at the age of 15 or 16, how it hurts. Arvindo Ghosh, all these men, Gandhi himself, racial, if Gandhi had not to face that kind of humiliation which he faced in South Africa, if he didn't have to suffer that agony of the question, who am I? Because I'm an Indian, because I'm an Asian, I'm not a human being. He wouldn't have grown into the Mahatma. So this was Vivekananda, for example. See, when he gets up in Chicago, Parliament religion, just a person who's unknown young man, and he speaks. It has a, I would say, magical effect on the audience. And then see the challenge.
But do you think, why do you think that the challenge of nationalism in some ways was more significant than the challenge of poverty and deprivation and illiteracy and
You asked a very significant question. It has been on my mind, and I give you Gandhi's example. Before Gandhi came on the scene, the Indian educated class was aspiring for independence, for self-government we call it, they were more moderate in expression for greater association of Indians with the administration of the country. But what was their time span? Lord Sinha was the first peer, Indian peer, and he was the first member of the Viceroy's Council, appointed in 1909, 10 I think. He thought it would take 300 years. Dada Bhai Naroji, one of the greatest men of the Indians who produced in the 19th century. He said that the Irish have been fighting for 800 years for freedom, and they have not despaired. Why are we getting tired? So as if we should wait for 800 years. Lord Curzon writes in his the discussion in the cabinet about the draft of the 1917 famous declaration that our British aim is self-government for India, progressive self-government for India. And he was asked, you are a bloody fool. You are advocating responsible government for India, and you were always opposed to any dilution of British Raj. What do you mean by it? He said, we discussed. We felt it would take time. And my feeling is it would take 500 years. And this is 1917 in the British cabinet. And Gandhi comes in 1920 and he says, Swaraj within a year. And when people said, what do you mean? You mean the British Empire can be liquidated through your non-violent non-cooperation in 1 year? Is 1 year not too short a period? He said, no. All birth takes place in a moment. The other thing was, he was saying that we want to change the British, that is, we want to, this is battle for the mind of the British, for Gandhi, that he has to convert them.
Right.
He has to make them change their thinking. On the other hand, he says that it is not only the British who have to change, but we have to change. We have to become fearless, we have to become responsible citizens, we have to behave in such a way that we are a united nation, we get our caste, we get our religion, communalism, and so on. Not only that, we have to discard our bad habits, untouchability must go, our sanitation must improve, our education must improve, and so on, and our health care must improve. And then these Nehru and others, Patel would say, what are you talking, Bapu? This is not politics. We will do it when freedom comes. He said, no, this work has to start right now. So this is the point, that the freedom movement, in Gandhi at least, looks after both these things. It is fight against injustice, yes. It is also fight for, should I